At the turn of the 20th century, high in the mist-covered hills of Eureka Springs, Arkansas, a new America was beginning to reshape itself. The Gilded Age had just passed, leaving behind a trail of wealth, towering ambitions, and a public eager for cures to the physical and spiritual exhaustion of rapid industrial life. Remote mountain towns became the favored escape for the affluent, places where fresh air, mineral springs, and quiet isolation promised restoration. Eureka Springs rose from obscurity into a booming resort city almost overnight, its economy built on hope, tourism, and the generous wallets of those chasing wellness. Amid this surge of prosperity and optimism, the Crescent Hotel emerged as a triumph of architecture and luxury. Completed in 1886, it stood like a palace above the Ozark Mountains, offering marble floors, grand dining halls, and sweeping views meant to soothe the anxious elite. The city's growing wealth, first from railroads, then from its health tourism frenzy, created the perfect stage for influential figures to rise and for bold dreamers to turn ambition into power. In an era obsessed with miracle cures and scientific showmanship, anyone who understood the performance of healing could build an empire. This is the world in which the Crescent was born, glamorous, fragile, and ripe for exploitation. Long before it became known as America's most evil hospital, it was a monument to prosperity and the illusions that prosperity can buy. And before we continue deeper into its haunted past, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and ensures you never miss the untold stories hidden behind America's grandest facades. Chapter 1: The Rise of Eureka Springs. In the latter half of the 19th century, when America was reeling from the aftershocks of the Civil War and the growing pains of rapid industrialization, there existed a small stretch of wilderness deep within the Ozark Mountains that seemed untouched by time. Dense forests, winding ridges, and fog-covered valleys created a landscape that felt more mythic than real. It was here, in this quiet corner of Arkansas, that the first whispers began. Stories of waters that could heal, springs that could cure, and a place where suffering men and women might reclaim the lives they feared were slipping away. These rumors traveled faster than the region's rough roads could carry them. By the early 1870s, travelers seeking relief from chronic pain, paralysis, skin diseases, and ailments that doctors had failed to treat began arriving in increasing numbers. They came from nearby towns at first, then from neighboring states, and eventually from the major cities of the Midwest and the East Coast. Each brought with them accounts of transformations that bordered on the miraculous. A man bedridden for a decade claimed to walk again. A woman declared free of a skin condition that had plagued her for 20 years. Whether these stories were exaggerations or genuine healings hardly mattered. What mattered was belief that somewhere in the wilderness existed a collection of springs, unlike anything known to science. This was the spark that ignited Eureka Springs. By 1879, the town had transformed from a cluster of makeshift cabins into one of the fastest-growing communities in the nation. Streets carved themselves into the steep hillsides. Wooden boarding houses sprang up almost overnight. Merchants, hoteliers, physicians, land speculators, entrepreneurs, and conmen all descended upon the area, each hoping to stake their claim in a new frontier economy built on hope, desperation, and the promise of healing. The population swelled so rapidly that the town was designated a city within a year. Newspapers across the country dubbed it the Miracle City of the Ozarks. Yet it was not only the sick who fueled the town's meteoric rise. It was also the moneyed tourists, members of the emerging upper class seeking rejuvenation, status, and an escape from the smog-choked cities of the Gilded Age. For them, Eureka Springs was not merely a destination. It was a lifestyle, a retreat, a statement of refinement and wellness. The wealthy arrived by rail, stepping out in tailored suits and dresses, ready to spend weeks or months living among the fresh mountain air and supposedly magical waters. They filled hotels, restaurants, bathhouses, and private cottages with the same fervor that industrialists filled factories. Soon, the town's economic engine roared to life. Grand hotels were constructed with the confidence of men who believed prosperity would never end. Streets were lined with shops selling everything from luxury goods to miracle tonics. Bathhouses advertised elaborate therapies rooted in both science and superstition. Doctors opened practices specializing entirely in spring treatments, while spiritual healers and self-proclaimed health visionaries wove themselves into the social fabric of the booming resort town. But beneath this outward success was another, quieter truth. Eureka Springs had been built on unstable cliffs and unstable promises. Its prosperity depended on belief in the spring water's healing power, belief that the miracles would continue, belief that the town would remain forever blessed, and belief, as history often proves, is the most fragile foundation on which a fortune can stand. Yet during these early years, none of that uncertainty mattered. The town radiated a kind of electricity. Carriages clattered along steep wooden plank streets, carrying visitors from one healing pool to another. The scent of pine and mineral water hung in the air. At night, lanterns cast a golden glow over balcony railings and wooden walkways that wound around the hills like threads of light. Musicians played in hotel parlors. Families gathered on verandas overlooking deep valleys, and every newcomer, whether sick or affluent, found themselves drawn into the same promise that here, in this secluded corner of the Ozarks, miracles were not just possible, they were expected. This feverish optimism attracted the attention of powerful investors, most notably the railroad companies, who recognized the economic potential of a health resort with national appeal. With their support, the town's growth accelerated even further. New routes were built to bring more tourists into the mountains, more hotels rose, more bathhouses opened, and with each passing season, Eureka Springs grew in wealth, reputation, and influence. It was during this period of explosive prosperity that a group of ambitious developers envisioned something unprecedented. A hotel so grand, so luxurious, so architecturally stunning that it would elevate Eureka Springs from a regional curiosity into a national destination. A hotel that would bring in the country's most affluent visitors, railroad tycoons, politicians, industrialists, and the newly minted aristocracy of America's Gilded Age. That dream would soon take shape in stone and timber atop the highest point in town, the Crescent Hotel. But before its beauty enchanted the elite, and long before its halls became infamous for suffering, shadows, and death, it was born from the same force that built Eureka Springs itself, a belief in miracles, a hunger for prosperity, and the unshakable conviction that fortune could be engineered from hope. In the beginning, the town was a promise. Soon, it would become the stage for one of the most unsettling transformations in American history. Chapter 2. The birth of the Crescent Hotel. In the fevered prosperity of the late 19th century, when America was racing forward with confidence and industry, a group of investors, railroad executives, and visionary developers looked upon the booming miracle town of Eureka Springs and imagined something that would elevate it beyond every other resort in the nation. A grand, commanding hotel so luxurious and so impossibly ambitious that it would not merely attract the wealthy, but define the very identity of the Ozarks. They wanted a palace, a mountaintop fortress of elegance that would proclaim the triumph of the Gilded Age, a structure so impressive in its silhouette and craftsmanship that the wealthy would consider it a destination worthy of weeks of travel. From this vision, the Crescent Hotel was born. Plans began taking shape in 1884 when the Eureka Springs Improvement Company, supported heavily by the St. Louis and San Francisco Railway, decided that a luxury resort would both symbolize and accelerate the town's meteoric rise. They spared no cost. They hired the legendary Irish stonemasons known for their cathedral-level skill, brought in not just for labor, but for their artistic mastery. These craftsmen quarried the pale limestone that caught sunlight like polished ivory, shaping it into massive blocks that would form the walls of a hotel meant to stand for centuries. Every stone was set by hand. Every arch, turret, and balcony was carved with the intention of inspiring awe. For 2 years, the mountaintop rang with the rhythmic music of chisels, hammers, and saws. Carriages carried materials up the steep slopes while crews worked through heat, storms, and bitter winters. Slowly but steadily, the bones of a palace emerged from the wilderness. What rose from the ridge was breathtaking, a sprawling, castle-like structure with sweeping verandas, pointed towers, arched windows, and a commanding presence that dominated the skyline. Visitors approaching the mountain could see the crescent from miles away, a shimmering crown above the forest, a signal that luxury had arrived even in the rugged Ozarks. Inside, the grandeur intensified. The lobby was anchored by a fireplace so massive that a man could stand inside it. Marble floors reflected the glow of gas-lit chandeliers. Hand-carved woodwork lined the walls. Imported furnishings filled the rooms. And the great dining hall promised evenings of refined conversation, music, and social rituals that defined high society. Every detail was designed to signal wealth and sophistication. Steam heat, indoor plumbing, lavish parlors, private reading rooms, gardens, stables, and verandas built for leisurely afternoons overlooking the sweeping valleys. When the Crescent Hotel opened its doors in May 1886, national newspapers hailed it as the most luxurious resort west of the Mississippi. Trains delivered the elite directly to its foothills. Wealthy businessmen recovering from urban stress, railroad magnates on extended retreats, prominent families seeking a fashionable escape, and patients drawn by the healing mythology of the springs. For a brief moment, the Crescent fulfilled its promise. Its ballrooms filled with music and elegant figures swirling under crystal light. Guests in silk gowns and tailored suits strolled along the terraces, whispering about investments, marriages, and political gossip. The dining room echoed with silverware and soft laughter. Carriages rolled up the drive, their wheels crunching over gravel as attendants rushed to receive trunks and open doors. The Crescent was everything the investors hoped it would be: a symbol of triumph, a celebration of wealth, a jewel of the Ozarks. But the truth is that even in its earliest years, the hotel's foundation was far more fragile than its stone walls suggested. The Gilded Age dream that sustained it, one built on limitless prosperity and a constant influx of wealthy travelers, was vulnerable. The seasons in the Ozarks were harsher than anticipated. The hotel's operating costs were far higher than projected, and most significantly, the miracle-based tourism that had fueled Eureka Springs' explosive growth began to lose credibility as the nation's medical community grew increasingly skeptical of unproven healing claims. As belief in miraculous cures waned, so too did the flow of wealthy patients seeking transformation in the mineral waters. The Crescent Hotel, built to serve an elite clientele in a niche market, began to see empty rooms. The opulent halls grew quieter. Investors grew restless, and the enormous cost of maintaining such a structure, its stonework, its heating systems, its imported furnishings, became a financial burden that no amount of elegant charm could hide. Management teams attempted adaptation. Some seasons emphasized social luxury and exclusive events. Others leaned heavily into health tourism, offering restorative programs and therapeutic regimens. But the dual identity of the Crescent, half palace, half wellness retreat, proved both a strength and a dangerous weakness. It allowed the hotel to survive longer than it should have, but it also created a doorway for something far more sinister. Because once a building becomes known as a place where the vulnerable seek healing, it is only a matter of time before someone unscrupulous sees opportunity. By the early 1900s, the Crescent, though still admired for its architectural majesty, was no longer the thriving jewel it had once been. It opened and closed in cycles, changed ownership multiple times, and shifted purposes frequently, from resort to conservatory to seasonal retreat. Yet through every transformation, the structure remained intact, standing like a silent witness to each passing era. But it was in this state of quiet decline that the Crescent became susceptible to its darkest chapter, a chapter defined by a charismatic showman who understood how to manipulate desperation, disguise cruelty as care, and turn a once grand hotel into the stage for one of the most disturbing medical frauds in American history. The Crescent Hotel had been built as a palace, a testament to wealth and hope. But its grandeur, its isolation, and its reputation as a place of healing made it the perfect setting for the events that would eventually transform it from a Gilded Age triumph into one of the most notorious sites of suffering, deception, and lingering hauntings in the nation. Its birth was magnificent. Its descent would be monstrous. Chapter 3. Decline and Abandonment. When Wealth Fades into Silence. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Crescent Hotel, once the shimmering crown of the Ozarks, had already begun to drift toward a fate no one could have predicted during its triumphant opening decades earlier. The grandeur that had defined its earliest years now stood in uneasy contrast with the economic forces reshaping America. The Gilded Age was giving way to new realities, scientific skepticism toward miracle cures, shifting tourism patterns, and a nation slowly awakening to the understanding that not all that glittered was gold. For a hotel built on luxury, exclusivity, and the mythology of healing, these changes were devastating. Wealthy travelers no longer made the pilgrimage to Eureka Springs in the numbers they once had. The great railroads, once the hotel's lifeline, redirected routes toward more profitable destinations. Advances in medicine dispelled the myth of miraculous springs, turning what had been Eureka Springs' most powerful attraction into a fading relic of an almost superstitious past. As visitors dwindled, the Crescent's vast hallways, once filled with elegant laughter, polished shoes, and the soft glow of chandeliers, grew quiet. Silence settled over the mountaintop like a heavy curtain. With each passing season, the hotel struggled to stay open, its financial reserves draining as rapidly as its guest list. The structure remained magnificent, but magnificence alone could not sustain it. The cost of heating the enormous stone building through harsh Ozark winters became a burden few owners could manage. The upkeep on the turrets, the verandas, the marble floors, the carved wooden interiors, all required continuous investment. Investment that no longer flowed as freely as the mineral water once had. And so, in an attempt to adapt, the Crescent closed its doors as a luxury resort and reinvented itself as the Crescent College and Conservatory for young women. The transformation, at first, brought brief optimism. The building's quiet halls seemed suited for academic pursuits, and families from prominent Southern households sent their daughters to study literature, fine arts, and etiquette in the mountaintop palace. But even this second life was fragile. Tuition could not match the revenue once generated by wealthy tourists. Operational costs remained crushing, and as the economic landscape of the country shifted once again, through recessions, war, and cultural changes, the conservatory struggled to stay relevant. With each decade, there were fewer young women able or willing to spend their formative years in such an isolated location. In 1934, after years of financial strain, Crescent College closed permanently. The building that had once embodied the highest aspirations of the Gilded Age now sat empty, abandoned to the harsh elements of the Ozarks. The silence that filled its halls was no longer quiet elegance, but the unsettling quiet of abandonment. Wind slipped through cracked window frames. Rain pooled on the once glittering marble floors. The great fireplace, once a gathering point for wealthy guests, became a cold monument to a past the town could no longer reclaim. Locals recalled seeing lights flicker on without explanation, though in truth, it may have simply been the last damaged wires, sparking in the dark. The building's isolation atop the mountain made it vulnerable to trespassers, scavengers, and decay. Its once meticulous gardens overgrew into tangled vines and shadowed pathways. Birds nested in the rafters. Paint peeled from the walls in long curling strips, exposing the raw stone beneath. The Crescent had not merely declined. It had become a place suspended in time, waiting for a purpose that refused to reveal itself. During these years of abandonment, a strange aura began to take shape around the hotel. Stories spread, some born of superstition, others perhaps exaggerated by the eerie silence that surrounded the enormous structure. Locals whispered that the building was cursed by its own grandeur, that no venture could thrive within its walls. They spoke of figures seen on the balconies at night, of soft footsteps in empty hallways, and of the sensation that the hotel was somehow still alive, watching, waiting, remembering. But beneath the folklore lay a harsher truth. The Crescent had become a monument to the fragility of wealth. Its rise had been fueled by ambition, belief, and the unstoppable momentum of a booming era. Its fall revealed the vulnerability hidden beneath that prosperity, a reminder that even the grandest institutions could crumble when the ideals that supported them evaporated. By the mid-1930s, the Crescent Hotel was no longer the glittering jewel of the Ozarks, but a decaying shell, a place of echoes instead of music, shadows instead of society. The magnificence that once drew the nation's elite now seemed almost tragic, a ghost of a dream that had outlived its time. The hotel's architecture endured, but its purpose had evaporated. Its lavish rooms stood empty, its ballroom silent, its great dining hall deserted. Each passing winter carved deeper wounds into its structure. Each summer scorched its already weakened beams. And yet the Crescent did not fall. It endured the decades of neglect with a stubbornness that seemed almost unnatural, as though the mountain itself refused to let it die. That endurance, both admirable and eerie, set the stage for the most shocking chapter in its history, for the arrival of a man whose dangerous charisma and ruthless ambition would seize upon the hotel's decline and twist it into something far darker than abandonment. The Crescent had faded from luxury into loneliness. Soon, it would descend from silence into horror. Chapter 4. The Arrival of Norman Baker. By the late 1930s, the Crescent Hotel stood like a wounded monument on the mountaintop, majestic but hollowed, beautiful but lifeless, a perfect canvas for the kind of man who thrived on desperation and illusion. And when Norman Baker arrived in Eureka Springs, the silence of the abandoned structure was exactly what he had been searching for. Baker was not a doctor, not a scientist, not even a man of education. He was a showman, a charismatic opportunist who had built an entire career on audacity, theatrics, and the dangerous confidence to present fiction as truth. Before stepping into the world of medicine, he had been a vaudeville performer, a radio personality, a self-proclaimed inventor, and a master of spectacle. His greatest invention, however, was himself. He fashioned the persona of a brilliant, rebellious outsider, someone who claimed to possess the cure for cancer, a miraculous treatment that conventional doctors were too afraid to accept. In reality, his so-called cure was nothing more than a toxic concoction of alcohol, watermelon seeds, corn silk, and carbolic acid. It cured nothing. It healed no one. But to a frightened patient, to a family grasping for hope in an era when cancer had no meaningful treatment, Baker's confidence felt like salvation. He understood this better than anyone, and he knew that if he could find a new stage, one isolated, dramatic, and grand, he could revive his fraudulent empire. That stage would be the Crescent Hotel. When Baker first set eyes on the abandoned building in 1937, he saw not decay, but opportunity. The palatial architecture, the remote mountain setting, the reputation for healing, it was a con man's dream. The steep stone walls and looming towers gave the hotel an air of authority. The sprawling interior offered endless space for laboratories, treatment rooms, and dormitories for patients. And the town of Eureka Springs, battered by economic collapse and desperate for revitalization, was primed to welcome anyone promising jobs, tourism, and prosperity. Baker arrived dressed in his famous white suits, always immaculate, always theatrical, speaking with the smooth certainty of a visionary. He purchased the Crescent, renamed it the Baker Cancer Hospital, and immediately launched one of the most deceptive medical operations in American history. From the moment he opened the doors, suffering patients arrived in droves. They came from across the country, pale and weakened, clutching medical files and doctors' warnings that legitimate treatments had failed. Baker greeted them with warm smiles, inflated promises, and a sales pitch sharpened by years of manipulating fear. You are not dying. They told you that, but they were wrong. Here, you will live. And for people who had been told to prepare for death, those words were irresistible. Inside the Crescent, Baker transformed the ballroom into a laboratory, though little actual science occurred there. He filled the hotel's rooms with beds for patients, some hopeful, some terrified, all clinging to the belief that they had found a miracle cure. Nurses in crisp uniforms tended to them, not realizing or refusing to admit that the treatments they administered did nothing to halt the disease ravaging their patients' bodies. Baker's hospital was not a place of healing. It was a carefully constructed illusion. He understood that suffering made people vulnerable, and he exploited that vulnerability with ruthless precision. Each day he delivered his treatments, injections of his toxic formula, claiming they attacked tumors and restored the body's natural strength. Patients writhed in pain, mistaking the burning of the chemicals for signs of progress. Some begged for relief. Others clung to Baker's words as though faith alone could rewrite their prognosis. Families paid thousands of dollars, life savings, mortgages, inheritances, to keep their loved ones in Baker's care. Meanwhile, Baker lived lavishly, outfitting the Crescent with ornate furniture, hosting parties, and strolling the halls like a self-appointed monarch presiding over a kingdom built on false hope. And as the patients weakened, the illusion darkened. Those who died were quietly removed from their rooms, sometimes in the dead of night to avoid frightening those still clinging to hope. Baker assured families that relapse was normal, that their loved ones simply needed longer treatment, more injections, more payments. The more they suffered, the more he insisted his cure was working. Beneath the hotel, in the stone-walled basement, the truth was far more grim. Baker stored the bodies of deceased patients in makeshift morgue spaces, keeping them hidden until arrangements could be made, or until he decided it was time to dispose of them quietly. Whispers circulated among townspeople, employees, and even some patients, but Baker's charisma and intimidation kept most silent. After all, many had staked their livelihoods on the success of the hospital. Others feared legal repercussions, and some, tragically, refused to believe the miracle they had trusted was nothing more than a lie. As Baker's power grew, so too did his arrogance. He taunted medical authorities, mocked legitimate cancer researchers, and broadcast radio messages accusing the American Medical Association of corruption and conspiracy. In his delusion, he saw himself as a misunderstood genius, a revolutionary savior unfairly persecuted by the medical establishment. But behind the grand façade of righteousness lay a predator, thriving on the desperation of the dying. The Crescent Hotel, once a palace of wealth and luxury, had become the perfect stage for Baker's darkest performance. Its isolation hid the suffering inside. Its grandeur lent credibility to his lies. Its history of healing made the deception feel almost natural. But the truth could not stay buried forever. Complaints mounted, investigations intensified, and former employees began to speak. Federal authorities watched Baker with growing suspicion, tracking his finances, his false credentials, and the trail of silent victims left in the corridors of the Crescent. Norman Baker believed he had built an empire that would last forever. Instead, he had built a ticking clock. And the moment of reckoning, long overdue, was drawing closer with every life lost inside the mountaintop palace he had twisted into a house of suffering. Chapter 5. Inside America's Most Evil Hospital. Inside the Crescent Hotel, during Norman Baker's reign, the air itself felt wrong. Thick, stale, and heavy with the scent of chemicals that did nothing but mimic the idea of medicine. Patients arrived believing they were entering a sanctuary, a healing retreat set high above the valleys of Arkansas. But once inside, the illusion dissolved into something far colder. The grand stone walls, built decades earlier to impress wealthy Gilded Age guests, now trapped the most vulnerable people in America's most fraudulent hospital. The moment they stepped inside, they were met not by doctors, not by nurses, but by attendants who knew little about medicine and even less about compassion. They repeated Baker's promises like a rehearsed script, assuring the desperate that they were safe, that they were curable, and that here, within these walls, miracles were routine. But behind their empty reassurances lay only suffering. Patients were stripped not only of their hope, but of any sense of control. Baker's so-called treatments were nothing more than injections of colored water mixed with alcohol, carbolic acid, and other substances that had no therapeutic purpose. Day after day, terrified men and women were escorted into treatment rooms that still smelled of steam, old wood, and unwashed linens. They were told to remain completely still while Baker's assistants plunged crude needles into their bodies, often hitting nerves or muscle, causing sharp bursts of pain that radiated through arms, legs, and spines. Those who cried out were silenced with a glare. Those who questioned were told they lacked faith. And those who begged to leave were informed that their life-saving treatment plan was not yet complete, while new bills quietly accumulated in the ledger. The hospital operated like a factory of despair. At dawn, patients were awakened by footsteps echoing down the long hallways, followed by the clanging of old radiators that never worked properly. Some rooms had no heat in winter. Others had windows that jammed shut in summer, trapping patients in suffocating air, while the Ozark humidity curled around them like a choking hand. Meals were sparse and often spoiled, served without care or cleanliness. Baker insisted the food was part of his cure. In reality, it weakened patients further, softening their will to resist. And everywhere, across each hallway, staircase, and basement corridor, hung a persistent dread, the kind that settled deep in the bones and whispered that escape was impossible. The worst suffering took place in the basement, a place patients rarely saw but always feared. It was here that Baker stored the remains of those who did not respond to treatment, preserving body parts in jars of alcohol that lined the shelves like a grotesque museum. Assistants cataloged tumors, organs, and sometimes entire limbs, each labeled with a handwritten tag, as if the dead were nothing more than specimens for an experiment he never intended to complete. Some bodies were buried in makeshift graves on the property. Others vanished entirely, wiped from records as though they had never existed. Families often received letters informing them that their loved ones had made remarkable progress just days after they had already died. Baker's cruelty ran deeper than fraud. It was administrative erasure, an attempt to rewrite reality to keep the money flowing. At night, the screams were the worst. Patients cursed by pain or terrified by their worsening conditions echoed through the hallways, bouncing off stone walls that were never designed to contain suffering. Some begged for help. Others prayed quietly, convinced their illness was devouring them from the inside. Baker, however, walked the corridors with theatrical confidence, wearing his white suit and purple tie like a monarch surveying his kingdom. He reminded patients that the pain meant the cure was working, and any worsening symptoms were simply the body expelling disease. His voice, always calm and rehearsed, became a weapon, soft enough to soothe, sharp enough to manipulate. And for many, that voice was the last sound they heard. But one of the greatest horrors of Baker's Hospital was how close it came to being accepted as legitimate. Guests, wealthy families, traveling businessmen, curious tourists would sometimes visit the lobby, unaware of what took place in the rooms just beyond. The grand staircase was still polished. The chandeliers still glowed. Music occasionally drifted from the dining hall where Baker hosted promotional dinners, promising hope to prospective patients. The façade of elegance shielded the atrocities occurring behind closed doors. Crescent Hotel, with its stone arches and sweeping balconies, maintained just enough beauty to disguise the rot within. Inside these walls, trust was weaponized, money was extracted, and human life was treated as a disposable resource. Patients who had arrived with determination left only as shadows, if they left at all. Their suffering stained the building in ways no renovation could remove. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of cold air, every flicker of a hallway light still carries the memory of those who endured Baker's deception. Because in America's most evil hospital, healing was never the goal, survival was never the outcome, and the walls remember everything. Chapter 6: Aftermath and Hauntings, the Spirits That Never Left. When Norman Baker finally fled the Crescent Hotel in 1940, leaving behind nothing but debt, empty promises, and a trail of devastated families, the building did not return to silence, because silence was no longer possible. Too much pain had been absorbed into its stone walls. Too much human suffering had seeped into the floors, the staircases, and the foundation itself. Even after federal agents raided the property and uncovered jars filled with preserved organs, tumors, and unnamed body parts, the building felt as though it exhaled decades of anguish in one long, chilling breath. Locals in Eureka Springs whispered that the hotel was cursed, not because of superstition, but because the structure had witnessed terror on such a scale that it could no longer behave like a normal place. Every door, every hallway, every shadow seemed to hold a memory that refused to fade. The Crescent Hotel, once a palace of luxury, now existed as a monument to deception, exploitation, and death, a place where history lingered not as stories, but as presences. The years after Baker's fall were chaotic. Owners came and went, each attempting to revive the grand property. Contractors reported tools disappearing, footsteps echoing behind them, and sudden cold pockets in rooms with no vents. Some swore they felt someone standing behind them, only to turn and find nothing but empty air. Guests who checked into the newly reopened hotel in the 1940s and 1950s were often startled by unexplained knocks on their doors, or by lights flickering in perfect rhythm, as if responding to an unseen presence. Over time, the most consistent reports centered on room 218, where a stone mason named Michael had fallen to his death during the hotel's construction in the 1880s. But after Baker's era, the activity intensified. Michael was no longer alone. Visitors described hearing a man crying softly in the middle of the night, a sound so filled with fear and pain that several guests immediately checked out, believing someone in the next room was dying. When staff investigated, the rooms were empty. The hospital years had created their own spirits, patients who had come seeking hope and left only with agony. Nurses who worked during later renovations said they saw figures in hospital gowns drifting through the hallways, moving with slow, unsteady steps as if still searching for a cure. One apparition, described by dozens of witnesses, was a woman with sunken eyes and thinning hair, clutching a blanket against her chest as she wandered near the old treatment room. She would turn to look at approaching visitors, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound ever came. In the basement, where Baker once stored the bodies of those he claimed to have cured, Workers heard the faint murmur of voices and occasional footsteps moving across the concrete floor. Some reported hearing someone knock from inside the walls. Others swore they saw jars moving on their own shelves, sliding an inch or two before stopping abruptly, as if an invisible hand had touched them. Perhaps the most chilling encounters, however, involved the figure many call the man in the purple shirt. Witnesses describe him as tall, well-dressed, and eerily calm, a man who appears in hallways or at the end of the grand staircase before vanishing in mid-step. Some claim he resembles Norman Baker himself, wearing the same theatrical style he proudly flaunted during his fraudulent medical career. Guests often report feeling a sudden wave of unease around this apparition, as if watched by a presence that carries both arrogance and cruelty. Psychics who visited the Crescent Hotel during the 1970s insisted the building still belonged to Baker in a spiritual sense, that he remained tethered to the place where his ego had flourished and where his lies had claimed so many victims. Whether these tales are folklore or genuine sightings, they all echo the same truth. The shadow of Norman Baker never fully left. As tourism increased, so did the accounts of paranormal activity. Visitors captured photos of mist-like silhouettes standing beside them in otherwise empty hallways. A tour guide once fainted after seeing a full-bodied apparition appear behind her reflected in a window. Even the hotel's famous ghost tour guides, accustomed to strange events, admit that certain areas still unsettle them. The antique elevator sometimes runs on its own, stopping at floors with no one waiting. Doors open gently, as though pushed by invisible hands, and the aroma of medicinal chemicals, sharp, metallic, and unmistakable, occasionally drifts through the air, despite no modern source within the hotel. Over time, the Crescent embraced its haunted identity, becoming one of America's most famous paranormal landmarks. But beneath the excitement of ghost sightings lies a deeper, more somber truth. Hauntings are born from stories that were never allowed to end. The spirits in the Crescent Hotel are not merely echoes of history, they are the unresolved remnants of deceit and suffering so profound that they bent the building's future. Each apparition, each strange sound, each cold breath of air is a reminder of the people who came here believing they would be saved, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare disguised as hope. And perhaps that is why the Crescent remains restless. Because justice arrived too late for many of its victims, because their final moments were marked by fear, manipulation, and abandonment. Because the walls still remember every whispered plea for help, every silent passing, every promise broken by a man who saw human life as nothing more than a financial opportunity. Today, guests check in for the thrill of encountering something supernatural. But for those who truly listen, those who stand in the quiet corners of the hotel at midnight, the hauntings are not entertainment. They are confessions carved into the air by spirits who cannot speak for themselves. The Crescent Hotel endures not simply as a haunted place, but as a ledger of unfinished stories, a warning etched in stone, and a testament to the idea that some tragedies never die. They simply linger, waiting in the dark. When you stand before the Crescent Hotel today, it is easy to be distracted by its beauty. The sweeping stone arches, the glowing windows, the elegance carved into every corner of its mountaintop frame. But beauty can mislead, and here, in this place where wealth once rose and deception later thrived, the past is never silent. The air feels heavier, the halls feel watchful, the building seems to breathe, because places touched by profound suffering do not simply fade into history, they continue to echo it. The Crescent Hotel is no longer Baker's fraudulent hospital, yet the residue of his cruelty lingers like a stain that stone cannot forget. Guests arrive seeking mystery, thrill, or proof that ghosts exist. But the real story is not about apparitions drifting through dim corridors. It is about the lives that were exploited, the hope that was twisted, and the dreams that ended behind walls built for luxury but repurposed for lies. Every whisper of movement, every cold gust in a locked room, every shadow that seems to follow you is a reminder of the people who came here believing they would be saved and never went home. What happened inside this hotel is more than a haunting. It is a cautionary tale about the danger of blind trust and the darkness that grows where desperation meets greed. And as long as the Crescent stands, the stories of those who suffered will continue to rise from the silence, demanding to be heard. If you want more forgotten histories, more crumbling fortunes, more places where old money met dark endings, then remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the next shadowed chapter waiting beneath the dust of America's past.